So you think it's hot today? You complain when it hits 90-degree Fahrenheit and your air conditioning takes 5 minutes to kick in? Meanwhile, a Roman peasant just raised an eyebrow from the afterlife. Back in the blazing heat of ancient Italy, there were no ice machines, no cold showers, and certainly no HVAC units humming in the background. And yet, they survived. They worked. They even napped. But before we uncover the clever tricks of these ancient heat warriors, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and tell us in the comments how you survive summer without going feral. Because what the Roman peasants lacked in technology, they made up for with grit, tunics, and vinegar water. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't easy, but it was brilliantly human. And trust me, by the end of this, your AC bill will feel like a luxury tax. Forget Pinterest toga aesthetics. Roman peasant fashion wasn't about looking good for the gods. It was about not dying of heat stroke while plowing a field under a sun that seemed personally offended by your existence. You didn't wake up and say, "What should I wear today?" You said, "How little can I get away with without being arrested by a centurion?" Let's be clear. The average Roman peasant owned maybe 2 tunics, if they were lucky. Both were linen or coarse woolachy, scratchy, and smelling faintly of goat butt thin enough to let air through and keep the sun off without cooking you alive. Tunic colors weren't bold or vibrant. You didn't wear purple unless you wanted to be executed for impersonating royalty. You wore mud white, sand beige, maybe olive-stained brown. You blended in with your surroundings, not because it was trendy, but because you didn't own dye. And shoes? Optional. The heat turned roads into baking stones, and sandals made from leather strips were your only hopey if you could afford them. Most peasants simply toughened up their soles. Over time, your feet became so hardened you could walk on thorns and not blink. But here's the genius. They didn't just endure the heat, they manipulated it. Roman peasants wore layers. That's right. In the peak of summer, some wrapped light cloth around their heads, shoulders, even legs not to warm up, but to protect from sunburn and dehydration. They understood insulation before the term existed. A wet tunic? Not a sign of exhaustion, a deliberate move. Dunk your linen in the river, put it back on, and enjoy 15 luxurious minutes of evaporative cooling before you're back to medium rare. And headwear primitive but effective. A folded cloth, maybe a straw hat if you were lucky, all to keep your brain from boiling inside your skull. Because unlike modern folks, you couldn't just walk into a 7-Eleven and grab an iced tea when you overheated. You collapsador, you adapted. And then there's hair. In Roman heat, long hair wasn't romantic, it was a trap. Sweat-slicked hair turned your head into a sponge for heat and lice. So, most men kept it short, and women tied it up high-functional buns and braids. Not to look good, but to survive. Beauty was accidental. Oh hand, forget perfume. You were too busy smelling like effort. A blend of sun, sweat, dust, and possibly sheep dung. But you didn't care. No one else smelled better. Hygiene was basic, and status didn't protect you from the stink of summer. The ultimate flex? Getting naked? In your own hut, at the end of the day, when the sun had finally set and the heat retreated like a defeated army, you stripped down to nothing, not for comfort, but because clothes held heat, and you needed every inch of skin exposed to cool down. No shame, just physics. Roman peasants weren't modest. They were thermodynamically efficient. Sweating wasn't optional. It was the Roman peasants' daily reality, like paying taxes or swatting flies. The sun didn't ask permission. It simply climbed into the sky like a bored god and poured itself onto your back until your tunic clung like wet dough. But here's the thing. You didn't panic. You adapted. Bathing, for you, didn't involve marble columns or echoing bathhouses filled with gossip. That was for senators and retired generals. You, a peasant, bathed with a bucket, a rag, and the kind of determination usually reserved for surviving wild boar attacks. You couldn't afford to waste water, so you got smart. You wiped yourself down with vinegar-soaked cloths or water steeped in mint and basil if you had them. Armpits, neck, behind the knees. You didn't bathe to feel luxurious. You bathed to not smell like you died yesterday. There was no soap. Soap was exotic, foreign, expensive. What you had was olive oil, not for flavoring, but for survival. You'd rub it across your body, then scrape it off using a Strigila curved metal tool that pulled away sweat, grime, and about half your dignity. It didn't make you clean, it made you acceptable, which, in a Roman summer, was more than enough. And yes, you sweated, copiously, constantly, but you weren't ashamed. Sweat was your body's only cooling system, and you knew how to work with it. Loose tunics, shaded work, controlled movement. You didn't sprint, you strolled. You didn't rush, you endured. Some days, when the air stood still and the heat wrapped around you like damp wool, you made your own breeze. A palm frond, a flat piece of pottery, the lid of a broken jar. Anything to stir the dead air, to tell the sun, I'm still here and I'm not melting yet. And at the end of the day, when the fields had stopped burning and the sky turned the color of overripe grapes, you'd sit by a stream or a muddy patch pretending to be one and soak your feet. The cool seeped up through your skin like a forgotten blessing. You closed your eyes, you breathed, and you survived. Sometimes, if you were clever or desperate, you'd take a handful of wet soil, smear it across your arms, your chest, your face, let it dry, flake, fall off like scales. It wasn't pretty. It wasn't poetic. But in that crust of earth, you found something no Roman poet ever wrote about: relief. You didn't have soap or shade or scented oil, but you had sweat, mud, and an understanding that your body, gross, gritty, glorious, knew how to protect itself. And that was enough. If you think staying hydrated today is hard, try doing it in a tunic under the Italian sun with nothing but clay pots and questionable water sources. No hydro flasks, no electrolyte powders. Just you, the heat, and a jug that smells faintly like last year's wine. The Roman countryside didn't hand out hydration plans. Wells were shared, streams were unpredictable, and aqueducts' glorious marvels of engineering rarely reached the poor. You drank what you had, when you could, and hoped it didn't come with bonus bacteria. Clean water was a luxury, and you weren't in that tax bracket, so you made do. And making do often meant reaching for a drink that modern taste buds would classify as, why is this burning my throat? It was called pasca mixture of water, vinegar, and sometimes herbs. That's right. When life gave Roman peasants heat stroke, they answered with vinegar water. Sharp, acidic, and totally effective. It killed off some of the microbes, kept your mouth from going dry, and most importantly, kept you from gulping too much too fast. Because that's the thing. Roman peasants didn't chug. You, sitting in your air-conditioned office with your 32-ounce bottle and your hydration tracker, might sip every 20 minutes. But in ancient Italy, you rationed. You took small, strategic sips. Not because you were disciplined, but because you had no idea when you'd get more. And there were rules. You didn't drink cold water when you were too hot. That could cause belly shock, a very real fear in a world without Pepto-Bismol. Instead, you drank lukewarm, slow, and carefully, like someone taming a wild animal made of thirst. You didn't drink during meals either, not unless you wanted your stomach to explode from imbalance, according to ancient medical wisdom. So hydration was a separate ritual, done with intention. Water was not background noise. It was sacred. And of course, everyone drank wine, but not the kind you're imagining. Forget the fancy stuff. This was watered down, sour red, often cloudy, sometimes chunky, yes, chunky. Wine wasn't there to help you relax, it was there to make your water safe. Even children drank diluted wine. Not to celebrate, but to survive. There was no concept of kids' juice, just varying degrees of liquid acidity. And when the heat peaked, when your head buzzed and your tongue felt like sandpaper, you didn't cry for ice. There wasn't any. You sat down in the shade. You cupped your hands. You whispered a silent plea that the next sip wouldn't come with a worm. But in your own way, you mastered hydration. Not with technology. Not with filters or apps. Just instinct, repetition, and vinegar. And on the hardest days, those brutal, bone-dry afternoons, you added a sprig of wild mint to your jug, Not because it made the drink taste better, but because it made life feel slightly more civilized. Even if your drink still tasted like pickled disappointment, you don't outrun the sun, not in Roman Italy, not in July. You respect it. You fear it. You learn to negotiate with it. Roman peasants knew this well. There were no sunglasses, no SPF 50, no clever little apps warning you when the UV index got spicy. There was only your instinct, your shadow, and the creeping realization that you had no backup plan if the sun decided to kill you today. So what did you do? You became a master of shade. Not the kind cast by fancy awnings or marble columns. No, your shade was crafted, coaxed, engineered from scraps of linen, branches, and timing. You studied how the sun moved across your fields, your roof, your one beloved olive tree. You knew exactly when the shadow would fall in the right spot, and you were already there waiting, clutching your jug of Pascha like a relic. You worked in the early hours sunrise to mid-morning. The moment your shadow shrank below your ankles, you stopped. It wasn't laziness. It was survival mathematics. From late morning to late afternoon, you entered what Roman peasants quietly referred to as the don't be an idiot hours. You retreated to the side of the house that never got direct sun. Every structure had one. Maybe it was the space between two grain sheds, or under the slight overhang where your chickens napped. Sometimes it wasn't even comfortable. It was just slightly less lethal. And if you were lucky, truly blessed, you had a vine-covered trellis. Not for grapes, no. You couldn't afford to waste good land on leisure fruit. These vines were for shadow. Grown for shade first, food second. Their twisting leaves gave your courtyard a kind of broken coolness, patchy, flickering, but enough to remind you the sun hadn't yet won. You stayed low to the ground. Saturday on damp cloth or bare earth. Your posture wasn't elegant. You folded yourself like laundry, conserving every drop of energy. And you didn't speak unless necessary words used heat, and you had none to spare. Children learned the shade game early. Mothers taught them to track shadows like animals, slipping from one to the next with the seriousness of soldiers. A good child didn't need to be told to get out of the sun. A good child disappeared before noon. And still it wasn't always enough. So you got creative. You soaked your tunic and hung it over a frame-instant swamp cooler. You dug shallow pits and sat in them. You even trained your animals to huddle near your body, not for warmth, but because goats, it turns out, are surprisingly good sunblockers. Every action was deliberate. Every corner of shade had a purpose. You didn't escape the sun, you outlasted it. And when evening finally came and the shadows stretched like yawning gods across the ground, you stood slowly, like someone peeling themselves off reality. You didn't cheer. You didn't celebrate. You just stepped back into motion, ready to finish what the heat had paused. Because in the empire of the sun, the smart ones didn't fight. They waited. They hid. And when the light retreated, they returned stronger. Nightfall should bring relief. It doesn't. Not for you, a Roman peasant in the middle of a scorching summer, lying in a house that spent all day soaking up sun like a clay oven designed by a sadist. By the time the stars crawl out, the inside of your home feels like the inside of a baked loaf. The air doesn't move. The walls still radiate heat like smug little furnaces. The only thing cooling you is the slow evaporation of your own sweat pooling under your spine. There's no mattress, no breeze, no fan to hum you into slumber, just you, your tunic, maybe, and the packed dirt floor, your only true ally in this war against temperature. Because the ground, unlike the walls, remembers the night. It stays cool just long enough for your back to stop throbbing. Your bed is a mat, maybe a straw pile. The straw, of course, itches and crawls. It's full of mites, fleas, and tiny disappointments. You turn, they turn with you. If you're lucky, your family sleeps with you 6 to a room, 2 to a corner, goats in the doorway. Not for love, for space, air, proximity to that sliver of cracked open door where some tiny mercy of a draft might exist. You breathe in dust, sweat, and the fermented bouquet of 3 generations' feet. And then there are the mosquitoes. Yes, the Romans had them. And no, they didn't have netting. What they had was smoke-burning dry herbs in little clay pots to create a fog of scent that only sometimes worked. More often, you just got used to being bitten. It became part of your bedtime routine. Like tucking in, but bloodier. You try to sleep, and the heat sits on your chest like a smug cat. Your eyelids stick, your neck is damp, your body forgets what it's like to feel cold. You shift positions. It doesn't help. You try lying on your stomach, now your face is wet. You roll to your side, now your hip is hot. Eventually, you just lie still, blinking into the dark, hoping fatigue outweighs discomfort. Sometimes you move outside onto the dirt courtyard. Not because it's safe, just because it's less unbearable. The stars look down like indifferent gods. You envy them. They float. You boil. And yet, in all this, sleep finds you not as a gentle visitor, but as a blunt force. You pass out from exhaustion, not peace. Your last thought is often a question, will tomorrow be hotter? But the body adapts. It always does. You learn to sleep in pieces, short bursts between the worst of it. You learn to listen for silence, for when the air finally gives in and moves. And in those moments, fleeting as they are, you sleep not deeply, but gratefully. Not because it's comfortable, not because you're rested, but because you survived the day, and night hasn't killed you yet. And somehow, that's enough. In the heat of a Roman summer, food isn't about flavor. It's about not collapsing. You don't dream of roasted meat or stews bubbling over a fire. Fire? The last thing you want is more heat. Even your stomach knows better than to ask for anything that sizzles. So what do you eat? You eat what doesn't sweat. Breakfast is usually a hunk of yesterday's bread, rock hard but dependable. You dip it in water, vinegar, maybe a little oil if you're lucky. Softened, but never soft. The crust resists you. It reminds you who's boss. And the answer is the bread. Midday meals are light. Not because you're watching your figure, but because digestion is dangerous when your body's already using all its strength to avoid spontaneous combustion. So you turn to cold things. Figs, cucumbers, olives, if the season's been kind. If not, barley porridge thinned with water, cooled to the temperature of disappointment, and you sit in the shade, spooning it into your mouth like someone remembering what food used to be. Protein? Sure, if you count goat cheese that's been aging in clay pots, or a few fish salted into the texture of leather. The idea of biting into a hot cut of lamb is as absurd as bathing in wine. Meat is for festivals. Today is just Wednesday, and it's 103 degrees. The idea is to stay light, to stay alive. Dinner is usually more of the same. Leftovers, maybe foraged greens, maybe a date or two if you have children who climb well. Everything eaten with your hands, slowly. Not because you're romantic, because you're tired. Holding a spoon requires optimism. You don't sit at a table. You crouch in corners, lean against walls, share bites in silence. Talking during meals means movement. Movement means heat. So you chew and breathe through your nose, pretending this lukewarm bowl of barley slop is something to be grateful for. And in a strange way it is, because it's there. Sometimes, to cool yourself, you pour a bit of vinegar water on your food. Sometimes, you just eat fewer bites. The less you digest, the less your body has to work. It's not fasting, it's strategy. Children learn early not to complain. They chew bread like it's sacred. Because to you it is. That bread came from grain you harvested by hand, ground yourself, baked in a stone oven that turned your kitchen into a shrine of suffering. You didn't eat to celebrate. You ate to endure. And when it got too hot to eat inside, you ate in the dirt, under vines, by the riverbank if it wasn't claimed by mosquitoes. You didn't ask for privacy. You asked for shade and silence. And if, once in a while, you found a melon plucked warm from the field and split open with bare hands, you didn't savor it. You devoured it, juice running down your arms, eyes closed, the cold sweetness reminding you briefly of what it meant to be human. It was messy, it was sticky, and it was perfect. In modern life, work-life balance means turning off email notifications after 5 p.m. For a Roman peasant, it meant not dying before sunset. The day wasn't divided by the clock, it was divided by temperature. You rose with the first breath of light when the sun was still friendly, still quiet, still not trying to kill you. There was no snooze button, there was the rooster, the creaking of wood, the crunch of sandals on gravel, and the heat already licking at the horizon like it had plans for you. You worked fast, not out of ambition, but strategy. Fields were tilled, animals fed, water hauled all before the sky turned white-hot and shadows disappeared under your feet. The hours before noon were your real day. After that, you didn't work. You waited. You returned home not for lunch, but for survival. The afternoon wasn't called midday. It was called the dead hours, because if you dared to labor under that sun, you wouldn't need a funeral. Just a shovel. So you rested. Not because you were lazy, because you were smart. Smarter than the heat. You lay on the floor, on mats, on dirt, wherever the air moved if it moved at all. Your family rested with you, sprawled out like exhausted laundry. Sometimes no one spoke for hours, not out of peace, but because speech used energy and energy was scarce. You napped, not deeply but in fragments, like animals, waking with every breeze, every insect, every scream of a child fighting over the shady spot by the doorway. It wasn't comfort, it was pause. And then slowly the world shifted. Shadows stretched, the sun bent its fury sideways, the light turned softer, redder, like a curtain of coals cooling just enough to approach. You rose. You gathered tools. You returned to the field or the workshop, still sweating, still tired, but no longer in danger. This was your second shift. The evening hours, short, sacred, efficient. You milked what daylight was left harvesting, mending, stacking, storing, and always with one eye on the sun, because when it dipped behind the hills, it took your window of safety with it. No one needed to tell you when to stop. Your body knew. So did the land. So did the animals. Everything in Rome's countryside bowed eventually to the rhythm of heat and shade. Work, rest, work. Not a schedule, a ritual. And when you finally returned home in twilight, shoulders sore, back bent, mouth dry, you weren't proud. You weren't fulfilled. You were simply not dead. And that was enough. The Roman Empire didn't give peasants statues or speeches, but it gave them one thing: time. Split in half, stolen from the sun. A life carved into fragments sewn for labor, one for hiding, one for healing. And somehow, when all those fragments were strung together, they formed something that looked a lot like resilience. You can face heat alone, but you won't last long. Roman peasants didn't just survive the summer, they survived it together, because when shade was scarce and water scarcer, what mattered most wasn't what you had, it was who you shared it with. Morning began with gathering, not at the forum, not in temples, but in the shadiest spot in the village, under a tree, behind a stable, in the narrow alley where the sun hadn't yet crept in. There, barefoot children and sunburned elders shared silence, gossip, bread crust sand, a mutual agreement: don't block the breeze. There were no fences, no air-conditioned escape pods. Your neighbors were your shelter. You took turns with the shade, rotated like sunflowers in reverse. And if someone elderly needed the best spot under the fig tree, you gave it. Not because of respect, because they'd earned it by surviving 40 Roman summers already. Water wasn't private. One well, one bucket. You filled your jar, then offered the rest to someone else, often without speaking. There were no rules, only instincts. You watched each other's faces for signs. Lips too dry, skin too red, breathing too shallow. You didn't ask, "Are you okay?" You just handed them the jug. Midday brought out the mats. Not bed-shared cloths laid flat on cool dirt where bodies could rest side by side. Adults napped. Children drew in the dust. A neighbor fanned the air with a woven lid, not just for themselves, but for the group. And no one said thank you. Because it wasn't kindness. It was protocol. You learned tricks together, hung wet cloth across alleyways to drop the temperature by a few degrees, built shade frames from broken wood and grapevines, stored clay pots of water in underground hollows and shared them when someone overheated. Not fancy, not pretty, but it worked. On the hardest days, Entire villages shifted to the riverbanks. Whole families, goats and all, walked miles just to sit thigh-deep in warm, muddy water. There was no privacy. You sat near strangers, floated near friends, laughed in the steam rising from your skin. Nobody talked about it later. It was a shared heat-induced amnesia-part ritual, part therapy. Even meals became communal cooling sessions. You ate in circles, back to back, blocking sun for each other like shields made of sweat and cloth. One person fanned, another refilled cups. The old lady sprinkled mint into vinegar water for everyone's jug, her hands steady despite the heat. No one asked her to. She just knew. And as night crept in, and the world finally softened, you didn't return to solitude. You stayed seated in groups telling stories, plucking lice, humming songs with no name, because the memory of the heat lingered, and in that memory was a quiet truth. You didn't survive the day. You survived each other. Not every empire is built with marble. Some are built with shared shade, past buckets, and the silent understanding that in the face of an unforgiving sun, human connection is the coolest thing you've got. We love to romanticize the past. Sunday-drenched fields, toga-clad farmers, slow lunches under olive trees, simplicity, peace, the good old days. But for the Roman peasant, there was nothing romantic about summer. It was a season of endurance, of split days and sticky nights, of mud on your arms, vinegar in your water, and sweat in places you'd rather not name. It wasn't peaceful. It wasn't picturesque. It was practical, suffering mastered with creativity, grit, and shared shade. They didn't beat the heat with luxury. They did it with timing, observation, and each other. And maybe, just maybe, that's the part we forget. We, with our thermostats and iced lattes, curse a 5-minute power outage like it's the end of days. But 2,000 years ago, people with no electricity, no fans, no modern, anything heard it out. They drank smarter, slept smarter, sweated smarter, and somehow, in the middle of all that heat and hardship, they still found time to tell stories, share water, and look out for the person beside them. So the next time your AC breaks or the power bill spikes, take a breath. Remember the people who didn't have the option to complain. And maybe, just maybe, try sitting in the shade with someone else. Because survival, it turns out, has always been a shared skill. If this video helped you sweat a little lesser, think a little deeper, give it a like, hit subscribe, and let us know in the comments. Would you have survived a Roman summer without melting? We'll see you in the next heat wave.